Hey, everybody. I'm not going to say good afternoon because this is a really great global event we're doing today where we've got three folks coming in from, all over the world. So welcome. I'm Rob Atkinson. I'm the founder and president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. And, my passion really since I started my career at the National Institute of Standards and Technology a long time ago was really about how countries, and particularly in my case, the US, can advance and adopt and craft really smart advanced industry policies to stay competitive in the global market. And I have to say, well, we've had some successes. Overall, we've been pushing the boulder up the hill most of the time because and what we called Anglo-Saxon economic framework, people like Larry Summers and others are just so dominant. It's so hard to shake that. So that's what we're going to try to do today. And the reason I call it Anglo-Saxon is that there's this sense of economics that Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the UK, and the US, we all share that. So we've got three great speakers today, all folks I know and have enormous respect for. Roy Green, who's a special innovation advisor at the University of Technology, Sydney, from down under. He's worked in universities, business and government on Australia, led projects on productivity and industrial policy, including with the OECD and the EU. He's also served on a number of different government commissions in Australia. So Roy really is a leading voice, particularly now in the new Labour government, which was a little bit more focused on this than the prior government was. Peter Nicholson is the chair of the Canadian Climate Institute. He's also a distinguished policy expert with decades-long experience shaping Canada's long-term economic strategies. He's also He's also on the board of Canada's ITIF's Canada Centre for Innovation and Competitiveness. He's had numerous posts in government, in business, in higher education. He was the founding president of the Council of Canadian Academies. He was deputy chief of staff to Canada's prime minister, and he was a special advisor to the secretary general of the OECD. And finally, Nick Timothy. Nick is a member of parliament representing West Suffolk over in the UK. So Nick, I think you're probably the latest in terms of time here. It's, what is it, 10 o'clock your time?
It's just past 9, but I confess I am keeping myself entertained.
Go for it. It's somewhere, it's 5 o'clock everywhere, so we should all imbibe. And he is a prominent voice in UK politics and frankly, a refreshing voice. He had a deep expertise in economic and industrial strategy. Before he was elected, he had a number of posts across government, including Joint Chief of Staff for former Prime Minister Theresa May. He's been a strong advocate for revitalizing Britain's industrial base and former business consultant and was a columnist for the Daily Telegraph. So we're gonna structure this as a conversation, but let me just give a little bit of background. As I said earlier, our four countries, including the US, we all fundamentally share the same economic policy playbook. It might not be obvious to a lot of people, but it really is. It's what almost all the policymakers have in the back of their mind when they're saying, is this a good thing to do or is it a bad thing to do? And you can call it the Anglo-Saxon economic playbook. This was really driven by economists all the way back to Adam Smith, but Alfred Marshall in the UK, and then obviously leading economists in the US. And it's still really what, if you get a PhD in economics in Australia, Canada, the US, Britain, this is what you're taught. I want to say indoctrinated, but maybe that's a little too harsh, but certainly this is what you're taught. And so what is it real briefly? So the Oxford reference defines Anglo-Saxon capitalism as a system of capitalism characterized by extensive market coordination by economic actors and relatively neutral patterns of government market regulation, aimed at maintaining property rights institutions without privileging social actors. So notice a couple of things there. It didn't say organizational coordination or institutional coordination, because in Anglo-Saxon economics, the firm is just a black box. It's really meaningless. The only thing that really matters are price-mediated markets. companies, individuals, everything's in their labor markets. There are pollution markets. Everything is a market. And it's really based on a few core tenets. One tenet is a dollar is a dollar. This is the source of the famous quote by a Bush economic advisor in the early 1990s. Potato chips, computer chips, what's the difference? Well, in Anglo-Saxon economics, a dollar is worth a dollar. Ipso facto, stop, full stop. The second point there is that the sum of the private interest is in the national interest. So if it's in the interest of the Wall Street banks to finance the rise of industrialism in industrial development in China, that's fine. It's in their interest, so it must be in the national interest. In fact, there really is no national interest when you really get down to it. It's just a bunch of individual interests that aggregated. A third is that the market failures are few and far between. The market gets pretty much everything right. And why bother with anything when the market gets it all right? Now, I won't go into all the details. The vast amount of literature that shows that is a fairy tale. It's a myth. There's so many market failures, and the simplest one being the externalities from R&D. There's just one to point out there. Companies get maybe 30%, 50% at best of the benefits of their R&D. That spills over to other companies, other actors. So without government involvement, you're going to have a society that underinvests there. Another one is that anything that gets in the way of free markets is welfare reducing. So it's in a lot of ways, it's sort of Pollyannish. We're living in the best possible world, and only what government action can do is only get us to suboptimality, unless there's some barrier, and then you get rid of it, and then you get to optimality. So the burden of proof of doing anything is very high, because the notion is everything's great, everything works, and so why do a CHIPS Act in the U.S.? Why have programs in the UK to advance, the Catapult program to advance manufacturing? The market gets it right. And then the last one is that under all this, basically because of all that, a small government is best. And so we saw that really starting in the 80s with Reaganism here, Thatcherism in the United Kingdom. In Australia, you saw a similar movement by Bob Hawke, and then in Canada by Mulrooney. And that sort of neoliberal or Anglo-Saxon playbook has dominated since then. So I want to jump into the conversation, but I do want to make a very clear statement so that nobody's confused. Certainly ITF, we're not saying Anglo-Saxon economics is a failure, and therefore we need to sort of adopt a anti-corporate, anti-business, anti-market liberal progressivism, like Elizabeth Warren, for example, would advocate. Absolutely not. That's taking one bad thing and replacing it with another. What we're really talking about is sort of national developmentalism, or for those of you who follow it, kind of Listian economics or Hamiltonian economics, the role of the state in enabling the market and companies in particular to do better. So I want to maybe start with saying, what are your, first of all, any thoughts on that framing for any of the three of you? And then maybe more to the point, why do you think that Anglo-Saxon economics doesn't work anymore? I mean, you can make a case that there were so many extreme problems in the 80s that had built up that maybe a Thatcherist shock, maybe that was a Reagan shock, maybe that was useful. But I think it's hard to make the case that we need to keep doing that. So anyway, anybody who wants to jump in there, just either raise your hand, raise your other hand, or just jump in. Nick?
Well, okay, somebody's going to start. Yeah, I think you laid out the rationale, I guess, for the Anglo-Saxon economic paradigm. So one of the obvious questions is why has it won the war of ideas? That was a question you suggested to us before we began, and well, I think what happened is that the alternative, let's say the alternative, was Keynesianism after the Depression and World War II, and that had run its course really by the end of the 70s. There was a great deal of overreach. Governments were beset by deficits as far as the eye could see. and then along came stagflation, and the conventional economics of the time failed to account for that. So that really opened the way for a new intellectual paradigm, which in fact was an old one, because as you said, it goes back with roots almost to Adam Smith. So I think that was the first reason why it won the war of ideas. And then, look, in fairness, it worked pretty well, at least up until 2008, particularly the variant practiced in the United States. And then finally, what was the coherent alternative? There certainly wasn't an intellectually coherent alternative being put forward. There were lots of individual isms and ologies, but nothing that could really command broader support. Anyway, I'll stop at that.
Great, thank you. Nick.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Peter said, and I think the conversation about Thatcherism in this country, certainly within the Conservative Party, I think actually demonstrates the fact that thinking hasn't moved on very much at all over the last decade or so. So certainly since 2008, which obviously marked the fallout from the financial crash, but also in this country marked the Climate Change Act and the beginning of a process that led to British industrial energy costs becoming horrifically uncompetitive, and we're still grappling with that today. I mean, the way I try to explain the situation here, and I think there are some similarities across our countries, because there are obviously so many interconnected factors. But I like to start with the trade deficit, which we tell ourselves in this country, oh, it doesn't matter. People were hung up about this through the sort of 60s and 70s. But the trade deficits, I think, quite a good place to start on the basis that it's a product of the problem, because we're not making and doing and selling enough of what the world needs. But it's also a cause of the problem, because it sort of creates these kind of reinforcing problems. So obviously, if you run a trade deficit, you end up risking a current account deficit, which makes you poorer. And what we do to avoid that in Britain is to basically fuel an addiction to what we quite often euphemistically call foreign direct investment, and sometimes it is investment, but actually quite often it's just foreign private equity companies buying up utilities where we have systematic over reward for investors, and end up with poor investment. And there are certain parts of our economy that feel really broken as a result. We have foreign sovereign wealth funds buying up property and land, causing property bubbles. And it reinforces a lot of the regional problems that we have, because a lot of the flow of the capital comes back into London, which is already doing sort of well with its high-end services economy, and not into the regions which have lost their industrial base. So it was a big political thing for the Boris Johnson government to talk about levelling up to try to address these regional inequalities. But I kind of felt that we were really talking about symptoms and not causes, because in the end, the cause is the economic model.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. President Trump just announced our own sovereign wealth fund yesterday, so we're going to be buying up large portions of the UK in the next few years. So don't worry.
Borrowing money to do so.
Buying it off Qatar.
We'll
borrow the money from the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund. Yeah. Roy.
Just one comment on what Nick just said about trade deficits. I mean, in Canada's case, we run pretty much balanced trade on goods and services with the world. A little bit of a deficit recently, offset by a little bit of a surplus with the U.S. But if trade deficits counted a lot in the case of Canada, I think we'd look to be doing reasonably well.
I would add,
largely because Canada's blessed with natural resources and energy exports and so on. Yeah.
But still.
Sure.
I mean, I do think that's one of the things about that I think is different than if we wanted to call this. I mean, there's all these different terms: endogenous growth theory, Schumpeterian economics. What I use the term is producerist economics. Really, but I think the key there is, what Hamilton warned in the U.S. is we did not want to be an economy that was a drawer of water and a hewer of wood vis-a-vis Britain. And so I take your point, Nick, about the trade deficit as it's hollowed out UK manufacturing. And maybe over to you, Roy, because that's been the Australian story. Boy, oh boy, loss of manufacturing built on the back of minerals exports to China.
Yeah, so it's an economy, and good morning from Sydney. It's an economy that is very largely correlated with that of Canada. And I'll come back to the Australian case and the challenges facing an economy which is highly resource dependent and therefore not very complex, and experiencing a precarious and very narrow trade mix. But just going back to Nick's final point there on the problem of the economic model, let's start with that and go back a bit into the history of economic thought, which, by the way, isn't taught anymore in most university courses, which I think is a real shame, because you're only going to get one version of that economic model if you go to university now. And indeed, when I did my PhD in the UK, I remember that turning point that Peter referred to there, the end of the Keynesian consensus, which was announced on television by the then Labor Prime Minister, Jim Callaghan. He said to a country that was experiencing some big economic setbacks, we can no longer spend our way out of recession. And that was the turning point where monetarism became the dominant economic and political ideology. But going back even further, when we refer to Anglo-Saxon economics, we're really referring to what historically has been known as neoclassical economics, in its more extreme form, neoliberalism. But neoclassical economics replaced classical economics in the 19th century, which placed a great deal of store on growth, capital accumulation, technological change. It was about the wealth of nations. People confuse Adam Smith simply with his emphasis on competition. It was much more than that. It was about a theory of value and growth. And it was taken up by David Ricardo. And of course, when it was adopted also by Karl Marx, people took fright and thought, well, we'll have to find some other way of describing our economy, and moved to neoclassical economics in the late 19th century, whose focus was not about growth and accumulation, but allocative efficiency, with market clearing prices, and ultimately, in the hands of those economists, static equilibrium models, which exclude technological change. And so how can we possibly understand what's going on in an economy using such a narrow framework, which has become so narrow, it's really, in the mathematical models we see now, how many angels can we fit on the head of a pin? By contrast with what Rob has called producerist or productivist economics, which is mostly associated with Joseph Schumpeter and the school that's sometimes also known as evolutionary economics, that analyzes the dynamic process of capital accumulation, and which is more to be seen in countries like Germany and Japan, and those who have valued the significance of advanced manufacturing. And added to now, of course, by the latest Nobel Prize winner in economics, Darren Acemoglu, with the role of institutions. And that's incredibly important, but again, assumed away in the narrow neoclassical or Anglo-Saxon economic models, somewhat brought back now in policy terms under the Biden administration and by others who have realized that neoclassical economics might have hit a dead end because we don't have any more reliance on the market to achieve the optimal outcomes that those economists assume in their models. But maybe I'll stop there. Well, also just to add that in Germany, as you also pointed out, Rob, Friedrich List with his national system of political economy set the scene for their industrial policy over a century or so, which replaced UK in world markets. And now the Chinese are doing something very similar.
So, you know, you mentioned Roy, this notion of technological change, and really, I think if there's a core difference between the two models, the neoclassical or Anglo-Saxon model, it really sees the whole point as you pointed out, as allocation efficiency. As long as the markets are set right, the prices are right. You get a little bit. You don't want too much wheat versus too much corn. You know, that you want to allocate that. When the reality is that all of the advancement of Western living standards have come from disruptive innovation, from productivity, which is driven by technological change. You know, back, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, I used to be part of this lunch group of economist types in Washington, and there are people at the Fed or at the Treasury or Congressional Budget Office and the like. And I always remember this one conversation where I brought up Schumpeterian technological change and that there needed to be a role for government in advancing it. And the person said to me, she said, look, Robert Solow showed us that technological innovation is simply manna from heaven. There is nothing that we can do to make it faster. Now, one can laugh at that, but you look at somebody like Alan Blinder, who was head of the Council of Economic Advisors under Clinton. He's one of the leading economists in the world. Alan Blinder says that in his book. There is nothing that economists know how to drive technological change and productivity. And when you sort of walk away from that, given that productivity is probably one of the core challengers in all four of our countries, whoa. You're basically saying, yeah, we think that you have cancer, but we know nothing about oncology. Here's some vitamins and good luck.
Yeah, the productivity challenge is huge and affecting exactly the Anglo-Saxon economies that we've been talking about, including Australia. Our productivity growth here is the lowest over the last 10 years than it has been for 60 years. Globally, there's various explanations that have been provided, one of which is that it doesn't really matter because most of the big changes that we need have already happened, namely commercial flight, urban sanitation, the telephone and television. They're the real big ones. So why worry about the internet? That's Bob Gordon, I think, at Northeastern University. His view was we don't need to worry. A second view was that we can't measure it, and maybe there's productivity happening that we can't measure because a lot of it is intangible with the digital revolution. The third approach, which seems to have been accepted now by a lot of economists, especially at the OECD, is that all countries have a number of frontier firms at the edge of technological change and research and innovation, and these have high productivity growth, but they're an exception. And most firms, a lot of SMEs, are sluggish and what they call laggards. And the productivity growth in a country is measured by how many frontier firms you can assemble, and also how much technology diffusion you can achieve within your economy. And that seems to be a good interpretation, but those countries that have those large numbers of technologically advanced firms with an institutional structure facilitating diffusion are not the Anglo-Saxon economies, and certainly not Australia.
Not at all. Peter.
Get unmuted here. Yeah, I'd like to make a few comments on this because I think it's important to understand what really has caused the decline in the rate of growth of GDP per capita, which really you see in virtually all countries, not well, other than the new Asian countries, those that were catching up to the productivity frontier. It's very widespread. I mean, not only in North America, but also in Western Europe, clearly Australia. So why? And there are two factors. One is on the demographic side, in other words, the labor force participation as a proportion of the population, and that's suffered a drag due to sheer demographics, the aging of the population. But the second fact is more or less the maximization of the female participation rate. The increasing female participation rate was a significant driving force of hours worked as a proportion of the population. And that clearly is one of the key factors in GDP per capita growth. The second, obviously, is productivity, and that's the most significant one in the long run. And when there are a number of headwinds that Robert Gordon did speak of, and Roy, you certainly mentioned one of them is the exhaustion of the low-hanging fruit of let's call it the second industrial revolution. But there were others, one being essentially the maximization of the basic education rate. Once almost everybody had at least a high school degree, and now everybody, or almost everybody, has got a college or some kind of post-secondary education. That source of growth, and remember what I'm saying here is focusing on growth, not level, because the growth is really the phenomenon that we're concerned about. A second factor on the productivity side has been the falling weight of agriculture and manufacturing in the GDP of all the advanced countries. And those were sectors where productivity growth has been traditionally most rapid. And we understand that because it relates to, in the case of agriculture, machinery and plant science. In the case of manufacturing, certainly machinery. The next factor would be the increasing regulatory burden. We've seen that in all of the advanced societies, and there's no question that has interfered with, again, the allocative efficiency, if you come back to that example, but it certainly has been a drag on productivity growth. And finally, I mean, there's a purely arithmetic factor at play here. And that is the difficulty of sustaining any exponential. When we talk about growth, we always talk about it in percent per year. And, to grow 3% per year when you've got 100 units is very different from growing 3% per year when you've got 500 units. So you have to keep coming up with larger and larger absolute increments to sustain a constant exponential rate of growth. And the only way to do that, and this sort of closes the circle of the discussion, is you have to innovate. You have to find new ways of creating value, or else the irreducible arithmetic constraint of exponential growth will sink you, along with all the other factors I've mentioned. So I think it is really important to have a good background understanding of the factors that are responsible for this decline of GDP per capita growth. But the reason why that is so significant is that the per capita GDP is also the tax base. So it is the basis by which we finance all of the other features of the good life and maintain a civil society. So we can't say that GDP per growth is no longer important. It certainly is.
Sure. I had a response, unless you wanted to jump in, Nick.
Well, can I just say a couple of things?
Yeah, please do.
Let you maybe sum up this section. I agree with all of those things. I think there's certainly from a British perspective, there's a few more things to say about per capita growth and productivity growth. We've had I know other countries have too, but we've had a pretty sustained experiment with monetary policy. So it wasn't just QE following the financial crash, but actually we had pretty significant QE injections during Brexit and during COVID, and I think there are definitely consequences of that for the real economy and distortions in corporate behaviour. I think when we talk about energy, and I know I've already mentioned it once, we talk about things like industrial energy prices and what that does for competitiveness. And I'm aware that Britain is in a slightly different position to your countries. But with net zero, there's also the question of the opportunity costs of the huge amounts of capital that are being pushed into the transition. And in effect, we are asking people to spend enormous sums of money, and they are on energy on sources of energy and energy technologies that in reality, regardless of what you think about the importance of decarbonisation or our ability to affect climate change from our own countries, in sort of economic and social terms, outcomes that are perhaps as good as, but actually often worse than what was possible with fossil fuels. So, and we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of billions of pounds of investment that could have been invested in other parts of the economy. We also, and I know Peter just mentioned our aging societies and the direct consequences of that. The patterns of immigration that we've had when we think about per capita growth and when we think about things like the tax base, the patterns of immigration we've had are actually, I think, long-term damaging for our economy. So the numbers have been extraordinary. That obviously produces disincentives for things like investment in technology and in some cases skills and training. But actually, most of the studies that are starting to come out now, that I'm not sure very many of these kinds of studies really existed 10 or 20 years ago, show that the kinds of profile of migration that we've seen are long-term, incredibly costly from a fiscal perspective. So studies in Europe that show that asylum migrants of the kind that we're dealing with illegal channel crossings, on average, the net lifetime fiscal cost is around £400,000 per person. And there are similar studies for other kinds of low-skilled migration. So I think, and that's before you take into account things like the effect on the capital stock. So I think there's quite a long list of things to discuss in this respect.
Yeah, Nick, I think those critical points. Your point about green. You can say, well, we need to do it or whatever, but anybody who says that green investment has increased productivity is just simply wrong. Green energy is still more expensive than just burning coal. The only hope I have there is perhaps there's a giant breakthrough in nuclear fusion, and we get energy at a 20th of the cost. I mean, a fifth of the cost, maybe that'll happen, but we certainly haven't seen it yet. And then I think
fusion's been 20 years away for how many decades?
A million years. We did a study at Fusion back at the Office of Technology Assessment in the early 90s, and we said it was 20 years away. So I think it's getting closer, but whatever. Certainly, we've spent a lot of money on that. That's not an investment. It's spending. Your point about immigration is clear. In the U.S., there's very clear evidence that high levels of low-skill immigration limit automation because it reduces labor costs. And then I think Roy or Peter, you mentioned overregulation. So there's all these sort of headwinds that get in the way of that. But I wanted to argue for a second theory, which is Schubertian long wave theory. So my first book was actually a British publication, is Edward Elgar, publisher, and it argued that basically about long waves of innovation, and I believe that. I think that technological innovation goes in cycles, and there's sort of more incremental and less important and less transformative innovations that build off of the breakthroughs. So my hopeful side says, hey, maybe we're in an up wave of that. I still think it's early, but you think about the potential of robotics, certainly AI, which is an enabler of robotics, but in other areas, and genomics. So part of me thinks that we could be poised for an increase. But I want to tie it back to the whole conversation, which is, we have these puzzles about productivity, and the very last place people look, because economists don't know how to open up the hood of enterprises. It really, at the end of the day, what's going on in an organization, whether it's a public health agency or a big nonprofit or a large corporation or a small corporation, that's where productivity, the rubber hits the road. And I don't think we know anything near enough of that. I mean, there's a great quote by Paul Krugman. He says that productivity is the most important thing in determining economic well-being, but we know nothing about it as economists, so I'm not going to talk about it in my book. That's pretty damning. My thought on this, by the way, is I keep a little log of really, really cool sort of advanced productivity things I see around the world. And I'm like, well, why are they only there? Why aren't they widely adopted? So I think in a lot of ways, we have these great, like, I don't know, Roy, my view of Australia is I think Australia has more automated garbage pickup trucks. There are certainly places in the world where you have self-driving garbage pickup trucks with a thing that automatically puts it in there. I saw a thing in China last week where this brand new Chinese hospital, 100% drug delivery. When you're in a hospital, you got to get drugs. It sends it down to the drug basement room. 100% automated drug delivery to the rooms, 100% accurate. Some of the ports around the world that are fully automated and just incredibly modern. You compare that to the U.S. So there's lots of things that have advanced to the frontier, and somehow we haven't been able to catch up with a lot of that. So I'm not sure what that is, or if you all agree with that.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Rob. And your organization has come up with an interesting analytical tool, which we've applied in Australia. We wrote together a piece on the so-called Hamilton Index, which measures the presence of advanced industries, 10 nominated industries in advanced economies. And if one is the average across, if we look at a location quotient of 1 across the world, Australia is right down the bottom, less than 50% of 1, 40.46, in terms of the presence of those advanced industries in our economy. And that wasn't always the case. And a bit like Britain, I guess, to some extent, Canada have deindustrialized, but we've deindustrialized for different reasons from the UK. We had a great reforming government in Australia in the 1980s and 90s, the Hawke-Keating government, which transformed our economy. It removed most of our tariffs, but it's often forgotten that apart from liberalizing the economy, it also had a very effective and comprehensive industrial policy, which took advantage of the shift going on worldwide from large vertically integrated mass production industries to smaller, more specialized, highly research intensive firms. And we grew a lot of those at the end of the 1990s. Indeed, so-called elaborately transformed manufacturers were the fastest growing part of our trade mix, of our export mix, by the end of the 1990s. But then we were hit by something which gave us, well, a sugar hit, I guess, the commodity boom, which boosted our terms of trade, made Australians 15% richer over a 6-year period without having to do anything except for waiting for the Chinese to buy heaps of iron ore at inflated prices. That sent our dollar through the roof and made a lot of that emerging manufacturing industry uncompetitive, and over 100,000 jobs in manufacturing disappeared overnight. And that's the legacy that we've now been struggling with. People ask, why is R&D such a small proportion of our economy, given that we have great researchers here in Australia? In terms of funding from business and government, it's now down to 1.68%. The OECD average is approaching 3%. Korea, Israel, and others are around 4 or 5%. But it coincides exactly with the decline of manufacturing, which is the main source of R&D in most advanced economies. And at last, we have a government here which is taking that on with its policy called Future Made in Australia. And it's, in fact, using the energy transition as well as the digital revolution to reconstruct our economy. And hopefully, we have an election in a couple of months' time. Hopefully, they get to finish that job.
So, Roy, I want to follow up on that, maybe just on that point about deindustrialization, because on our Hamilton Index, all four of us are below the average. Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Germany, Israel, way ahead, Singapore. Peter, this is not the same story as Australia, but a similar one in the sense of there has been a significant loss of manufacturing. I think Canada's location quotient is 0.5 or something. And then same thing, you got a lot of great scientists, a lot of great universities, but it hasn't been able to translate into the kind of growth of innovative companies that you need. What are your thoughts?
Well, the Canadian situation is almost a perfect mirror image of Australia's. And in our case, I think the root cause has been our integration with the US and the North American economy. And our comparative advantage in that integration has been upstream in virtually every industry. So the Canadian economy has ended up highly specialized in resource extraction as opposed to upgrading, finance, construction, and of course branch plant activity in all of the technologically advanced areas. So industrial structure answers basically all of the perennial mysteries in the Canadian economy as to why we're not doing more R&D, why we're not patenting more, why our exports are still so commodity oriented. Having said that, business profitability has not only held up, but improved both in top line and bottom line as a proportion of revenue and as a proportion of GDP. So where is the incentive to change that model? And this isn't just in the last few years. I mean, this has been the story in Canada for as far back as records go. And oddly enough, just as a parenthesis, the free trade agreements with the US, which were supposed to, by increasing competition and scale opportunities in our market, and therefore leading our businesses to go more upstream or downstream, I should say, into more sophisticated areas, has had the opposite effect. The Canadian economy, if anything, has become less industrially sophisticated over the last 20 or 30 years. But at that same time, the corporations haven't. And so I always say, unless it hits the bottom line, I don't know what's going to change that behavior in Canada. Now, we can go into as and when it will hit the bottom line. And just as a preface of that, I think the Trump shock, whether it comes in the form of a imposition of tariffs or other factors, may be the shock that the Canadian business sector needs. But absent something like that, it's very, very hard to change any of the usual metrics in Canada because the economy has been very profitable notwithstanding.
You know, I want to turn it over to Nick, but a quick aside there. Well, Peter, clearly you haven't read Ricardo because, you know, this is Portuguese wine. You guys are making great maple syrup. Send it down south for our pancakes, and we'll send you up software and computers. And
I think we've done that very well.
We'll call it a day.
Thank God for oil and gas is all I can say.
Yeah, that
Nick,
industrial structure question,
Yeah.
sorry, just to finish on Peter's point, is absolutely central. And that's the big problem facing both the Australian and Canadian economies, Australia in particular, with its resource dependency. Another way of measuring that, apart from the Hamilton Index, is the Harvard Atlas of Economic Complexity, which measures the diversity and research intensity of the export mix. And Canada, I was doing the comparison with Canada the other day. In fact, The Economist a few months ago did a funny little piece on Australia and Canada together and imagined we were one country called AusAnada, and looking at, we'd be the fifth largest country in the world in terms of our economy, but looking at the very common problems that we both face, especially innovating our products and getting them into global markets. But the point being of this complexity index is that Canada is number 41, way outside the OECD. Top countries, of course, are the usual suspects: Japan, and Switzerland, and others. And we're down at 102, behind Bangladesh. So I keep saying to my colleagues here, or to anyone who's prepared to listen, just imagine Australia was 102 in the Olympic medals table. Would we be taking some action? But 102 in terms of economic complexity doesn't seem to bother anyone, provided that iron ore is getting paid for by the Chinese, which may not happen if those Trump tariffs restrict the sphere of the Chinese economy in the future. We're entirely dependent on that.
Yeah, this is what, I don't know what day it is, February 1st or something, early February. I don't know what day it is. But clearly we're going to have 5th. Thank you, Nick. I don't wear a watch. I don't even have a calendar. We will talk a little bit about Trump and Trumpian economics before we close. But Nick, thoughts on this? In many ways, the UK is industrialized for a long time. You have a low location quotient. Your issue maybe perhaps is not so much a natural resource, although you had the oil shock, or oil boom a little bit, but City of London issues maybe is the bigger issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe we, I think one of the themes of the conversation is that there are certain similarities, because it is obviously the case that our economies are based on the same sort of theories and policies that arise from those theories. Although it may be that Australia and Canada have been protected from the consequences of the limitations of those theories in a way that Britain has not, because of natural resources, and maybe also for other reasons which we could potentially go into. And it's certainly the case that while we actually do have gas reserves that could be fracked, we do still have North Sea oil and gas, but the government we have at the moment is refusing to issue new licenses for exploitation in the North Sea, which is, I think, suicidal and hugely damaging to the economy of certainly sort of Aberdeenshire and the east coast of Scotland. But I actually, my main sort of reflection through the conversation so far is that we are talking about the consequences of the implementations of theories that don't really reflect the world as it is. We still talk about international free trade, and I think maybe fewer people do it with a straight face now, because actually the debate has moved on a little bit with China in particular after COVID. But of course, it's not just China. I mean, it's the stronger East Asian economies grew, with strong industrial strategies and protective tariffs. Germany benefits from the way the European Union is constructed, and the way the Eurozone's monetary policy works. The surplus countries benefit from from holding down the costs of their own production at the expense of the deficit countries, and the deficit countries are quite often the Anglo-Saxon countries. And more specifically, comparative advantage, which is still treated as unimpeachable in the UK Treasury. I think in reality has been a byword for outsourcing production to China and elsewhere at the expense of our own medium to long term prosperity. And I was interested in what Peter said about the real world effects of Canada's integration with the economy of the US. These theories would say that British integration into the European economy through the European Union would have made Britain better off, and according to certain metrics, you might say it did. But it's undoubtedly true that that through that period, British industry declined in a free market versus the industries of Germany in particular. In some cases, the French. Maybe Britain lost certain forms of protection because the barriers to trade were removed, but those trade agreements also did not address some of the more structural advantages given to some of the European companies that prevailed. And yes, it's true that to some degree, although the single market in services was never completed, to some degree, British services prospered within the European Union. But when comparative advantage narrows that far, and maybe you should think of it in sort of sub-national terms rather than national terms, then significant parts of our economy, certainly from a regional perspective, but from a sectoral perspective, suffer enormously. And that takes you on to another, I don't know if you can call it a theory or just a mindset, but I sort of think of it as this kind of crude utilitarianism, where you have kind of government by impact assessment, and obviously impact assessments are completely loaded, that all of these calculations are anyway, with ideological or philosophical assumptions and the kind of data that's available. But notwithstanding those things, basically, if in an overall national sense, the impact assessment, you punch everything into the computer and it whirs and it says there's a slight net advantage on a national level, therefore it's good. Regardless of what that means for particular parts of the country or particular groups in the country or particular sectors of the economy, I think we've tested approaches like that to destruction, and that's one of the reasons we're in the state we are economically, but socially and politically as well.
Nick, can I ask you a question, which is, how do the British now reflect on the high point of the North Sea oil and gas boom in the 1980s and 90s, where the market was allowed to rip, as it was in Australia during our commodity boom that led to the destruction of our manufacturing? The experience seemed to be that you had a massive consumption boom as a result of these windfall gains from North Sea oil, which was spent on a lot of Porsches while public infrastructure fell apart, and you were left without the investment that could have been made in the future of new industries and jobs. By contrast with Norway, which kept its ownership of at least half of the oil and gas reserves through Statoil, set up a 76% resource rent tax, and a sovereign wealth fund, which is now the largest in the world and can invest in the next 10 generations of Norwegian research and innovation. We look at that now with some degree of envy and remorse. I wonder how the UK is looking at their experience.
I quite enjoyed the characterization, although I have to say I don't remember very many Porsches growing up in Birmingham in the 1980s. But I think there's a growing number of people who look back at that period and say this, and there is the contrast with Norway. And I mean, it is still the case that Britain could exploit some of these natural resources and chooses not to through its own policies. I think the 80s was obviously a period of massive dislocation, and some of those resources were spent on compensating the people who lost through that period, and there were large numbers of people who did. Yes, yes, there was the consumption that you described. I mean, I think in one respect, though, I would just add some caution, which is, it's true that industry declined and some of the old industries that had been propped up fell away through the 80s. But manufacturing in Britain actually then recovered in the 90s before starting to fall away again the early 2000s. Which I think some of that was just huge structural changes in the world economy and the rise of Asia and so on. But some of it is much more to do with I think some of the consequences of European integration and I would say that the testing and failure of some of the economic theories we're talking about. And some of it is quite elementary stuff about things like, well, I mean, you mentioned public infrastructure, public investment in infrastructure. That's correct. But on something like energy, I mean, Britain went from having some of the most competitive industrial energy prices in the developed world to in say the 1990s to sort of gently rising through the 2000s, and now I mean our industrial energy prices now I think are sort of 3 or 4 times higher than America and Canada, 2 or 3 times higher than in France, twice as high as in some of the European countries that rely on nuclear, some of the Baltic countries. So I think there's some truth in that, but I think we failed on a number of levels.
So I want to, by the way, folks who are listening, feel free to, we'll move to questions in a little bit. Feel free to put your questions in the chat. But Nick, you raised a point about, and I think Roy, you did as well, that there was a kind of a shock in the 80s, and then things started to kind of restructure and come back a bit. The shock in the 80s was a policy shock. Get rid of the deadwood and allow markets more to work, and then things started to come back. And then there was a much bigger shock, which was obviously the rise of China. And when you think about the free trade, when you think about the neoclassical or Anglo-Saxon model, trade is only there for one reason, and that's to boost global allocation efficiency. That's it. And it's based on the assumption that trade is generally going to be free. And even worse than that, though, there are many people in the United States who are I would call in the expert class, who will say it is in the United States interest to be a free and open market, even if other countries are cheating. If they want to sell us their solar panels at a discount, they're the suckers. I kind of feel that way about Canada. If Canada wants to sell us timber at a discount, we'll take it, man. Who cares about timber? We got timber, and if you stop selling it, we'll grow more. But when you start talking about the decimation of industries like solar panels, like telecom equipment, like LCD displays. I don't think Airbus and Boeing are going to sell very many more planes in China. The fastest ordered plane company in the world in terms of sales is going to be Comac this year. And so, to me, one of the core failures of neoclassical economics is it just ignored that whole thing, and massive deindustrialization occurred. Like in the U.S., we estimate that we lost over about 60% of our manufacturing job loss was due to China and other kinds of globalization. It wasn't due to productivity. Productivity in manufacturing in the U.S. grew more slowly in the 2000s than it did in the 90s, and we only lost 3% of our jobs in the 90s in manufacturing. So I want to use that as a segue into sort of how do we begin to, because what I'm worried about, there's a group, there's a foundation in California, the Hewlett Foundation, and they funded an enormous amount of projects to come up with an alternative to what they called neoliberal economics. 100% of those projects were how do we craft progressive, sort of anti-capitalist, anti-innovation economics, not how do we craft producerist or Schumpeterian economics. So how do we go about advancing that? And then are any of you optimistic about what you're seeing in your own countries in that thing? And maybe Roy, you might be the most optimistic because sounds like the Albanese government there is more focused on this than perhaps we Canadian or U.S. or Britain. But why don't you start with that, Roy, if you would?
Yeah, sure. I just see also there's a question in our chats. How do you think President Trump is going to fund the new U.S. sovereign wealth fund, and to what amount? Maybe we should answer that very quickly first and say he hasn't got a clue, but he probably likes the word sovereign, and he loves the word wealth, and he's put them all together in one phraseology. And as for where the funds will come from, well, look.
Can I just quickly intervene? He has said, to be fair to the president, he wants half of the TikTok sales.
Yeah, that's it.
Which half of that revenue will somehow go into this fund. So,
yeah, it'd make a lot more sense though. U.S. is now the largest LNG exporter in the world. He should tax that, and that's how you create a sovereign wealth fund. That's something that we did not do in Australia. It's just been estimated by our former Treasury Secretary that if we imposed a tax on our fossil fuel exports at the current European carbon price, the Australian Treasury would receive an additional 156 billion Australian dollars, which is about 100 billion US dollars a year, that it could use for a sovereign wealth fund or many other things. And so we've missed a lot of chances in Australia, which we're now tackling. And is there a producerist approach to this? Well, it's a struggle here because, as you said right at the beginning, we have an institution called the Productivity Commission, which is a misnomer because under their stewardship, productivity growth in Australia has never been worse. And yet they want to blame everyone except their own policy recommendations, which are all about just lower corporate tax, deregulation, the usual things, as opposed to why don't we have a comprehensive industrial policy which doesn't ignore the market, but is devoted not so much to comparative advantage, which is where we base our approach on access to natural resources, but competitive advantage, as it's sometimes known, which is based on our knowledge and ingenuity. And how do we create a research and innovation system to support all that? We have an inquiry going on at the moment looking at our research and innovation system and how we reconstruct that so that it can build the industries and jobs of the future, which we have identified as part of our what we call the National Reconstruction Fund here, which is a fund to take equity and loans in companies that are trying to scale for global markets and provide an alternative, or at least to supplement our reliance on the export of natural resources, because those two sources of revenue for Australia, one is iron ore, the other is coal. Thermal coal is certainly on a diminishing path. Coking coal less so, because that's used for steel, but even that could be replaced if we move to green metals. And iron ore is very precariously based because the Chinese don't want to be dependent on Australia. They're expanding their interests in West Africa and elsewhere. And as their economy slows down as well, they won't make as much use of iron ore in the future. So we're very precariously placed, and we do need to develop new sources of value in our export mix. And the government having, successive governments having disparaged industrial policy thinking for 20 or 30 years is now coming round to the view in all political parties, in fact, not just the Labor Party, which is in government, to the view that there is scope for more industrial intervention, but of a clever kind. It's not going back to protectionism, not imposing tariffs on everyone like the Trump approach, but a much more clever, finely tuned policy to look for what are the areas of current and potential competitive advantage that we can double down on and take our research into the marketplace, develop products here as opposed to seeing them picked off by especially US companies in our space and defense industries, and use also the opportunity of the energy transition to build new industries there in renewables. So there's a lot of opportunity, which gradually governments in Australia are beginning to perceive and act upon, but it's taking a long time because we're up against that ideology in the Treasury and the Productivity Commission.
Yeah. So Nick, thank you, Roy. That's pretty interesting. Nick, the UK is a little bit like the US in the sense of pretty constraining handcuffs on how much fiscal headroom you have. From an outsider's perspective, it didn't really look like Prime Minister Sunak was able to do much. Maybe Starmer's kind of focused on that, but it really doesn't appear like it kind of reminds me a little bit of Trudeau, a lot of focus on equity issues and green. How do you see this movement, if you will, or this doctrine, or translating into policy in Britain? And where are sort of the green shoots that you're optimistic about?
I hate to break it to you, but I'm not sure I see many green shoots at the moment.
Okay.
Well, so we obviously have a Labour government that was elected in July, which talks about industrial strategy, and we will see something, of that form. The Secretary of State responsible for industrial strategy seems to come to the House of Commons more often to announce the government response to the closure of a strategic industry so far. We're basically losing steel making in this country. There is, I would quibble about lots of aspects of their industrial strategy and where they're going. The most obvious dissonance is with the very radical energy policies they're pursuing. So that, for example, they're promising to decarbonize the whole grid by 2030, which I think most people think is not possible. But the main report that they are using to justify that decision as not only affordable but desirable requires an increase. The assumptions in the report include a massive increase in the UK carbon price, a more than doubling, which which the government tries to have both ways, to say they don't support those assumptions, but also use the report to justify their policies. but a carbon price like that would kill what remains of British industry straightforwardly. But they've also made some pretty big changes with fiscal policy, which caught a lot of people by surprise, including the bond markets. So the Labour manifesto said they would increase spending by £9.5 billion per year, and the budget a couple of months after the election increased spending by £76 billion a year, which is a bit of a difference. And a lot of that spending is unfortunately not in investment spending. So there's a lot of public sector pay increases, and at the same time as increasing borrowing and taxes to fund those decisions, things like transport capital budgets are being cut. So this is I think pretty cool by I think the opinions and positions that I assume we four share. And I think what the experience has shown so far is that actually there is limited room for manoeuvre for any kind of government when it comes to fiscal policy, because for a variety of reasons, including things like the closure and maturing of British pension funds, the existing high stock of UK debt that needs to be refinanced, other borrowing by governments internationally. There just isn't much scope for anything other than fairly careful fiscal stewardship, because that's the situation we are in.
Yeah, and it seems like in that position, you got to start thinking about what are the things you could get out of the way of industry that don't cost you very much money, or modest kind of institutional changes, better incentives for universities to work with entrepreneurs, a whole set of things like that. I don't think any of our countries are going to do a Chips and Science Act again like what we had. That was a one-time deal. Unfortunately, we're just not going to do it. Peter, over to you. Kind of the same question I put to Roy and Nick, kind of the political economy of this in Canada. Canada is probably closer to an election than certainly the U.S., where it seems like though Mr. Trudeau has said he's leaving, and now you've got big race with Carney or others, and then Mr. Poilievre on the Conservative side. So I don't want to get you into the sort of political prognostication, but sort of both parties in Canada, how do they approach these questions? Both the major parties, not the Liberals.
Yeah, well, I think it's fair to say that the quality of the economic debate in Canada is atrocious. It's first of all, there virtually is none, certainly none that is based on a recognition of the situation that we're in. Right now, I can assure you that the next election is going to be waged on how to deal with Donald Trump, and I suspect that that's not going to be a very productive debate. If Mark Carney turns out to be the Liberal standard bearer, then we've certainly got somebody who understands neoclassical and Anglo-Saxon economics, but I think Mark is a more thoughtful guy than that. I always keep coming back to the same problem, that our industrial structure has really limited our ability to, let's say, absorb and apply commercially the good results coming out of our support for university science, which has been excellent. And the one thing I can say, and this argument isn't made often enough, that the main purpose of public support for university education at, let's say, the master's and PhD level in a country like Canada is to develop human capital. If you get some companies created as a result, and we do, that's a bonus. But it wouldn't justify all of the dollars we put into supporting basic research in Canada. But what it does do is it produces a cadre of people who throughout the rest of their careers are able to absorb and apply all the good ideas that are being developed around the world. And that's an important point I wanted to make as a comment on an earlier part of the discussion. And that is the importance of diffusion. That is really the primary way by which innovation is effective economically. And if you look at a country like Canada, for instance, or Australia, we will never come up with more than 1 or 2% of the good ideas in the world just by virtue of our share of population. So it really behooves us to focus a lot of policy on promoting the diffusion of innovation, the more rapid, the better. And there are ways to do that, but unfortunately, it's so little, it's such a small part of the conversation, which focuses always on, the 1 or 2 5-star entrepreneurs that you happen to have in your economy at any one point in time. So anyway, that was a little bit of a parenthesis. I think that Canada is finally coming to a come to Jesus moment, a comeuppance, and it's a combination of the long-term trends of petroleum prices, obviously a protectionism in the U.S., which I don't think is a passing fad. It's not just Trump. Now, how we react to that, it's going to be very hard to predict. I think that one of the early ways will be a relaxation of the regulations that have completely hamstrung our ability to get big things done. And particularly, well, any large public infrastructure project, but more relevantly right now, exploiting these critical minerals, which frankly are a way of revitalizing our resource potential when petroleum declines. But as a result of environmental regulation, which has really become reified and supported by a large NGO network, and also now a series of Supreme Court decisions, particularly related to Indigenous consultation, etc., have had the effect of tying resource development up in knots. Now, this is not to say that it's not a good thing to have Indigenous participation in resource projects. I think that's great. But with 630 individual bands, and in any project area, perhaps 6 or 7 tribes, it's hard to get them to all agree. And the net effect is things are at a standstill, and investment capital wants to look elsewhere. So I think that those are the challenges that have to be faced. Very, very difficult to raise them in a public political context because of the you have the impression that we're going to suddenly start to repollute the environment like the 1950s, and we're going to treat Indigenous people the way they were in the 1950s. That's unacceptable. So we have to somehow find a middle ground where both of those factors can be moderated somehow. And that will require some political genius, and I can only hope it'll be forthcoming.
Yeah, there was a little case I looked at in the U.S. We have the NEPA, National Environmental Protection Act, the 70s, good idea, ended up. But there was a case I looked at. They were extending a road in Pennsylvania, not in wilderness, just a road, another 6 miles. And the paperwork for the NEPA filings was over 2,500 pages for a 6-mile road. I want to shift over to Trump because I think we're in a world now where we're going to face a second China shock. It's going to be worse than the first one. It's going to be very severe in my view, and mostly in advanced technologies. What you think of DeepSeek? Interesting question, but certainly China's getting way better, obviously on EVs, aerospace, biotechnology, particularly biotech and genomics, and you name it. And then on top of that, we have a Trump shock. Trump is tariff man. He said that. He wants to go back, in my view, to the days of William McKinley, where we the U.S. economy was protected by a significant tariff wall. I think right now his tariffs are used as a sort of weapon for tool for negotiation, but I think their ultimate goal is to have large tariffs. That puts all three of your countries in a peculiar and difficult situation for all different reasons. I guess my last question would be, do you think that the shock, those two shocks, number one, will be enough to get people off of all the various sort of inertial factors and oppositional factors to change and self-interest, number one, to get off of that, and number two, to possibly embrace a more of a developmentalist approach? I'd look at Canada, for example. It doesn't, they talk about all this stuff, but at the end of the day, the urgency to me seems growing, but it hasn't reached the point of a tipping point yet. And I think that might be true in Australia. So anybody, why don't we just go around the horn and we can each sort of talk about that in terms of your own country experience, or where are we going to be in the next 10 years, assuming there's a Trump shock and a China shock, and is that going to shake things up in a good way or a terrible way?
It's certainly going to be a shock. And in Australia, are we prepared for that? Probably not. We have a deal now, and we haven't really covered this, the so-called AUKUS arrangement for defence, space, and all sorts of things between the US, UK, and ourselves. And that is supposed to encompass freer trade, not more restrictive trade. So a big question in Australia is, how will Trump tariffs affect our commitment to that deal? An extreme version might be to say, well, this is an attack on us, so why would we be part of AUKUS? You're driving us into the hands of the people this is supposed to compete with, namely the Chinese. So we haven't really had that debate yet. It's a lot of contemplation as to what are our options, because the main effect on us will not probably be through direct tariffs. We run a trade deficit with the US. It will be through China, and a China slowdown possibly, which affects our exports to them.
Great, thank you. Nick, thoughts on this? By quick aside, by the way, I was debating one of these hardcore national protectionist groups recently, and I said, yeah, man, but at least we can get a free trade agreement with the UK. No, free trade has hurt us. We can't have free trade agreement with the UK. And that I worry is the level of insanity in the US. This to me is sort of the easiest thing we could do together. And we could, another way we could think of, we should have a complete Commonwealth free trade agreement, with, total free trade. But anyway, Nick, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but go ahead, please.
Commonwealth free trade sounds like the dream of Joseph Chamberlain in the 19th century. And I'm a Joseph Chamberlain geek, so I like that. I think we as a country are because we know that our old model is struggling or maybe even dead, but we haven't yet worked out what to do. There are some of us push different kinds of ideas, but there's no sort of clear way forward really proposed by any of the parties just yet, and certainly not a consensus across party divides. I think we will react to these shocks with uncertainty, and will we oscillate between positions, both with America in mind and China. So what's happened with British policy towards China over the last 15 years has been, generally speaking, I was going to say accommodation, but it's much more craven than that. when policy has been set by the Treasury, and the Foreign Office is up for the same kind of thing.
Yep.
When more hawkish elements, in departmental terms, obviously the Home Office, maybe the Ministry of Defence, and others are in the lead, then we tend to pull back. When policy is driven more at a political level, actually it tends to get a bit more sort of realist and hawkish. But then when prime ministers and chancellors panic and say, we need growth at all costs, we need growth, the Treasury says, well, you've got to talk to the Chinese, and talking to the Chinese has tended to mean doing absolutely anything the Chinese want. That obviously then has consequences for relationships. So it's been the case that the Americans helped to push the more skeptical policy in the UK to get Huawei out of the telecoms infrastructure in this country. We're about to go through similar things all over again, I think, with different aspects of Chinese technologies of some of the kinds that you listed. Again, I think, given the scale of what the government wants to do with renewable technologies, the only place it's going to be able to get things like the turbines needed for what they want to do with wind, the panels needed for what they want to do with solar. I think it's a GBS technology in this country, but is to do that with China. And this Labour government faces quite a lot of internal political pressures to get closer to Europe, and they've reopened talks this week with Brussels about trying to reset, as they put it, the relationship. And it's quite interesting, and says something about the lack of intellectual self-confidence on the part of those who backed Brexit. But as Trump has been talking about big tariffs on Europe, largely driven by perceptions of advantages for Germany in particular, he's taken a different tone to Britain, and Britain, not being in the European Union, is no longer part of its customs union and has an independent trade policy. And there were some people, and are some people, who say even outside the European Union, we can be inside its customs union, which I think is an absolutely balmy proposition, because the negotiations ain't going to reflect British interests in the context of a trade war with America. So I think it will be bumpy, largely because we're not quite sure, in a big sense, what it is we want to do and who it is we want to be.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's fascinating. I think in a lot of ways that boils down to it. There was an FT article by Ganesh, somebody, I'm blanking on his last name, a very nice piece, which basically said, at the end of the day, you either want growth or you don't. If you really want it, that's what the core issue is. It's not clear any of our countries put that as number one.
Yeah.
Peter, we're sort of out of time, so why don't you maybe 2-3 minutes and then we'll close.
Yeah, no, I just want to really say one thing about the Trump shock. I think that we haven't seen the end of tariffs used as a negotiating tactic. The Canada-Mexico-US trade agreement is going to be up for renegotiation. And I expect that Trump will basically try to erase the border in economic terms between Canada and the US. He can't really absorb us as the 51st state in one gulp, but in two gulps it could happen. And there's not that much left, but there are still ownership restrictions in key industries in telecom, banking, transport. There are still the marketing boards in agriculture, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that we will be put under the gun to basically surrender 100% of our economic sovereignty. And how the country reacts to that is not obvious, because there will be consumer benefits. And some economists will say that the competition and the larger market, just as they did with NAFTA, is just the shock that the economy needs. So I expect there will be something titanic in the next 6 months in the Canada-U.S. relationship.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Our bank is a TD Bank, Toronto Dominion. I guess they don't call it. It used to be Toronto Dominion Bank. So at least one Canadian bank is doing well in the U.S. So this has been a fascinating conversation, and I really appreciate, first of all, everybody who's listening, but particularly the three of you. I feel like we're this this sort of little band of brothers in a way. There is a cadre of folks around the world, and many of them, and I know we all know many of us. So it's not like we're just a few. There are lots of people now who are thinking this way, trying to advance these ideas, both directly in terms of specific policies, but also more broadly, but what the framework is of how to go forward. So I'm going to leave us on an optimistic note, Nick, saying that I'm hopeful that will happen. It might not happen in the next 4 years in the U.S., might not happen in Canada, but I do think ultimately this has to be the path that we're going to go forward with. And I think more and more people are going to realize it. So with that, I want to thank everybody who's listening, and the video will be up on our website if you want to share it with any of your colleagues. So thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Rob, for setting this up, and nice to meet you, Roy and Nick.
Great to meet you too.